The empire must expand or it will perish. Perhaps it is in this very phrase that the secret of the Kremlin's perpetual aggression lies. Throughout history, no matter what that empire was called, Muscovy, Russia or the USSR, it aimed to seize and subjugate as many territory as possible, and it always denied its neighbors the right to sovereign existence.
The Russian attack on Ukraine is a logical continuation of the policy the aggressor country has been pursuing for decades. The Russian Empire did not cease to exist in the minds of its ruling class back in February 1917. It continues to exist even today. Unable to come to terms with the loss of certain territories, the empire is trying to reclaim them. Furthermore, it views all neighboring countries as its sphere of interest, sometimes interpreting this concept too expansively. In cases where political influence cannot establish control, they resort to weaponry. Today, we are discussing how Russia has attempted and continues to attempt to glue together its empire by occupying the territories of independent states.
Watch this!
After the collapse of the Russian Empire, its national peripheries separated and declared independence. However, the new Bolshevik government was unwilling to accept the loss of these territories. They regarded all regions of the former empire as belonging to Russia. Moreover, the Bolsheviks aimed not only to reclaim what they considered theirs, but also to occupy new countries under the banner of a worldwide revolution. They swiftly managed to achieve this with countries occupied by the RSFSR through bloody wars, such as Ukraine, Georgia and Azerbaijan. However, they could not gain control over the Western national peripheries. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland and Poland declared their independence. Russia paused, bided its time and accumulated strength for future annexations. The time came when they struck a deal with Nazi Germany, starting with the invasion of Poland. These two dictatorships simply divided the independent country between themselves. While Hitler officially declared war on Poland, albeit under false pretenses, Stalin chose a more cunning approach. The occupation of the eastern regions of Poland was labeled a liberation campaign. The Soviet troops' deployment was justified as necessary to protect the lives and property of the population in western Ukraine and western Belarus. The Soviet invasion of Poland commenced when the country was already largely defeated in the west by German forces, who were closing in on Warsaw. The Poles could not mount significant resistance. Independent Poland ceased to exist once again. Essentially, the Nazi and Soviet occupation of Poland in 1939 marked its fourth partition. After Poland, it was time for the Baltic states.
Watch this!
Even 80 years after the annexation of the Baltic states, Russian authorities and propaganda persist in claiming that the union was voluntary and by international law. However, facts and documents tell a different story. In 1920, Soviet Russia signed peace treaties with Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, recognizing their independence. These nations gained international recognition and joined the League of Nations. By 1939, the Baltic countries had thriving economies and non-aggression pacts with their powerful neighbors, Germany and the USSR. Yet the problem was that diplomatic commitments in Europe had little significance after the annexation and division of Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states in 3 stages, establishing a protectorate, occupation and incorporation. At each subsequent stage, they violated all earlier agreements. It all began with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Its secret protocol, consisting of only 150 words, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence for the USSR and Nazi Germany. The Baltic states fell into the Soviet sphere. Initially, Germany had designs on Lithuania, but Stalin traded for Polish territories, occupied by the Germans at the beginning of World War II. Following the Soviet troops' deployment and the start of the occupation of Poland, it was time for the Baltic states. By early October 1939, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, under pressure, signed mutual assistance pacts with the USSR. During negotiations held in Moscow, Molotov and Stalin resorted to blackmail, threatening to use military force in case of refusal. All three pacts of mutual assistance promised not to infringe on the sovereignty of the Baltic republics or interfere in their economies and governmental systems. However, the main point was different. The USSR established naval, air and land bases on their territories, with 75,000 Soviet soldiers stationed there. For the next 8 months, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania existed relatively peacefully, loudly declaring their neutrality and reluctance to participate in World War II. They still hoped that the USSR would be content with the concessions made and that annexation could be avoided. However, in April 1940, Germany occupied Denmark and Norway, followed by Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg in May. In this context, Soviet press started criticizing the governments of the Baltic states, accusing them of damaging neighborly relations. It was a signal of impending change. Despite economic difficulties, the standard of living in these republics was much higher than in the USSR. For this reason, Soviet soldiers stationed on military bases attempted to defect. At the end of May, Moscow accused Lithuania of kidnapping several Soviet soldiers. The Republic authorities tried to explain and appease Stalin, but received new accusations in return. Simultaneously, under the guise of military exercise, Soviet troops concentrated at the borders of the Baltic states. The military buildup included 435,000 personnel, over 3,000 tanks, and more than 2,500 aircraft.
Watch this!
On June 14, 1940, the German army entered Paris. On the same day, the USSR accused Lithuania of violating the Mutual Assistance Pact and issued an ultimatum. The Republic was required to establish a new government approved by Moscow and accept the unrestricted deployment of Soviet troops. They had 12 hours to respond. The president of Lithuania, Antanas Smetona, insisted on organizing armed resistance, but facing refusal from most of the government, fled to Germany. The Lithuanian cabinet of ministers decided to comply with all Soviet demands. While the Red Army occupied Lithuania, Molotov presented in the Kremlin similar ultimatums to the ambassadors of Latvia and Estonia. Here, the accusations were again based on the violation of Mutual Assistance Pact. Unlike their Lithuanian counterpart, the presidents of Latvia and Estonia, Karlis Ulmanis and Konstantin Pats, accepted the ultimatum's terms to avoid bloodshed. They were later arrested and sent to camps where they died. Soviet troops entered the Baltic countries, occupying their main centers and strategic objects. By the end of June, so-called people's governments were formed, consisting of local communists and left-wing intellectuals. They disbanded national parliaments and called for elections. Based on local communist parties, labor people's unions were formed, and they nominated candidates. All other political parties and organizations were banned. In this way, the communists faced no competition in the elections. Yet, even in these conditions, the process was not free from falsifications. During their initial sessions, the new parliaments declared their countries socialist republics and voted for petitions requesting annexation to the Soviet Union. In early August 1940, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR approved this. The occupation and annexation of the Baltic states were formally legitimized. After annexation, the Sovietization of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania proceeded rapidly. enterprises and large estates were nationalized, collective farms were established, and Russian language education was introduced. Repressions began with mass deportations of former officials, political figures, intellectuals, and clergy. Consequently, when in 1941 Germany attacked the USSR and occupied the Baltic republics within a few days, their population welcomed the Germans as liberators. After World War II, the Baltic states became the only members of the League of Nations, apart from defeated Germany, whose independence was not restored.
Watch this!
In October 1939, following the coercion of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania into Mutual Assistance Pact, the USSR offered Finland a similar pact. The Finnish delegation was invited to Moscow 3 times for negotiations in which the USSR presented territorial demands. Stalin claimed that Leningrad was too close to the border and demanded to move it 90 kilometers to the north. Additionally, Moscow required several islands in the Gulf of Finland and the lease of the Hanka Peninsula to construct a naval base. In return, the USSR offered more extensive territories in eastern Karelia, but these were not strategically valuable. Germany, fulfilling its obligations under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, advised the Finns to accept Moscow's terms and indicated that they shouldn't expect any assistance. However, the Finnish government did not agree to the Soviet ultimatum. In a democratic country, such concessions would hardly have been feasible in practice. The transfer of territories meant the loss of homes for thousands of Finns. Besides, it was clear that this was just the first step towards the complete absorption of the country. Negotiations reached an impasse, and both sides began preparing for a potential war. On November 26, 1939, an incident occurred near the Soviet border village of Mainila. Moscow claimed that Soviet servicemen were wounded and killed due to shelling from Finland. The Finns conducted an investigation and found that the shelling came from the Soviet side. In other words, shelling themselves in order to blame the other side was not a new tactic for Russia. On November 28, the USSR denounced the Non-Aggression Pact and diplomatic relations were severed the following day. On November 30, the Red Army was ordered to launch an offensive. On the same day, Soviet aircraft bombed and shelled Helsinki, causing damage to working-class residential areas. European diplomats protested, but Molotov claimed that the planes had dropped bread for the starving population in Helsinki. Subsequently, Soviet bombs in Finland were humorously referred to as Molotov's bread baskets. Importantly, just as with Poland, there was no official declaration of war. After capturing the Finnish village of Terijoki on Finnish territory, the Soviets formed a so-called People's Government there, led by Otto Kuusinen, a communist who had fled to Soviet Russia in 1918. Moscow recognized this proxy government and signed a treaty with it. However, no other country recognized Kuusinen's government. The puppet government asked Moscow for military assistance.
Watch this!
However, the Soviet troops encountered skillful and determined resistance. They could not break through the Mannerheim line immediately. It turned out that the Red Army was entirely unprepared for war. In Moscow, there was hope that the influential left-wing movement in Finland would not resist, and the Russians would enter the country not as invaders, but as helpers of a new government. Quite similar to the situation during the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. However, the opposite happened. Stalin was completely taken by surprise when the entire Finnish population rose to defend their homeland. The Finnish spirit was exceptionally high among those defending their land from the invaders. Marshal Carl Gustav Mannerheim, a former general in the Russian Imperial Army, served as the supreme commander of Finland's defense forces. Besides underestimating the combat capabilities of the Finnish army, the challenging terrain and severe cold played significant roles. Instead of anti-tank guns, which the Finns had in limited numbers, they immobilized Soviet tanks using bottles filled with incendiary mixtures, which were then named Molotov cocktails. The Finns widely employed guerrilla warfare tactics. Small autonomous key units would ambush stretched-out Soviet columns, and snipers caused significant damage. Advanced units that broke through were continually encircled. The initial phase of the war was a complete failure for the Red Army. By the end of December 1939, there was a lull on the front. Then, the Soviets employed a strategy they had historically used to win wars. They amassed forces and doubled their troop numbers, relentlessly overwhelming the enemy with casualties. On February 1, 1940, the Soviet offensive resumed. At an incredible cost and with immense effort, the Russians breached the Mannerheim Line. The Finns put up fierce resistance but were forced to retreat. Afterward, Finland was unable to halt the Red Army's advance, and there was a genuine threat of the country being captured, followed by annexation into the USSR. Therefore, the Finnish government in Helsinki reached out to the Soviet Union with an offer to start negotiations. On March 12, 1940, a peace treaty was signed. Finland had to make significant territorial concessions, much larger than initially demanded by Moscow. Finland ceded the Karelian Isthmus, part of the coast of Lake Ladoga, and several islands in the Gulf of Finland. The country lost 11% of its territory, and 430,000 Finns lost their homes. The signing of the peace treaty was a bitter ordeal. When peace terms were made public, Finns wamped in the streets and solemnly lowered their flags on their homes. The ratio of casualties was as low in the Winter War: 26,000 Finns and 127,000 Soviet soldiers perished. Russia once again won primarily due to its numerical advantage. The USSR suffered political damage and was expelled from the League of Nations. Adolf Hitler, closely monitoring the course of the war and seeing the flaws of the Red Army, believed that the Wehrmacht could easily deal with it. Another direct consequence of the war was that in 1941 Finland joined Germany in its invasion of the USSR. As for the Kuzunin government, it was quietly forgotten by Stalin, and after March 1940, no one remembered it. For Finland, the paramount goal was to preserve its independence, even at the cost of Soviet occupation of part of its territory.
Watch this!
In February 1945, the leaders of the anti-Hitler coalition, the USSR, the USA, and the UK, gathered in Yalta to discuss post-war arrangements. By the time, victory over Germany was only a matter of time, and the war was entering its final phase. For the first time, almost the entire Europe was under the control of just 3 states. The Allies understood that they had a unique opportunity to shape the post-war boundaries as they saw fit. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill signed the Yalta Declaration on Liberated Europe. It envisaged the restoration of the sovereign rights of nations in the territories liberated from Nazi Germany, as well as the right of the Allies to assist these nations. The idea of joint assistance never materialized. Each victorious power had authority only over the territories where its troops were stationed. As a result, each of the anti-Hitler coalition countries began supporting its ideological allies. Over several years, Europe was definitively divided into the Eastern Socialist Bloc and Western Europe, which fell under the influence of Washington and London. Stalin acquired Eastern Europe and parts of Central Europe as spoils of war. Puppet communist regimes entirely dependent on Moscow were installed there. Attempts to break free from the USSR's sphere of influence and pursue a path of democratization were brutally suppressed. Moscow was twice forced to send troops and occupy independent countries. Hungary was the first to experience the fraternal love of its enormous neighbor. After the war, a personal dictatorship was established in Hungary under Matthias Rákosi, whom they called Stalin's best student. The country underwent economic nationalization, the creation of collective farms, the suppression of dissent, political repression, and a struggle against the Catholic Church. After Stalin's death, Rákosi faced criticism and was removed from power. Imre Nagy, the new head of the government, assumed significant positions. An amnesty was carried out, forced relocations from cities based on social status were prohibited, industrialization was scaled down, pressure on agriculture was eased, and prices for food and tariffs were reduced. This led to discontent and criticism from Rákosi and his supporters. Using behind-the-scenes methods, Imre Nagy was removed from leadership. In October 1956, student demonstrations demanding the return of Nagy, a revision of Soviet-Hungarian relations, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops took place in Hungarian universities. On October 23rd, a massive demonstration in Budapest called for democratization. It began peacefully, but gradually the crowd became radicalized. Rebel units were formed, which started capturing weapon depots and police stations. The first casualties occurred. Printing houses, bridges across the Danube, and key highways were seized, and military units were disarmed.
Watch this!
At first, it seemed that the situation would normalize. Moscow initially had a favorable view of Imre Nagy and was not inclined to suppress the unrest with bloodshed. However, the uprising evolved according to its dynamics, and Nagy did not influence what is known as the Grassroots Initiative. On October 24th, Imre Nagy was reinstated as the head of the government, and Soviet troops were introduced into Budapest. Still, their numbers were insufficient, and the military soon withdrew from the city. Budapest fell under the control of the insurgents. A crucial turning point occurred on October 31st when demonstrators stormed the building and lynched around 20 individuals, including the first secretary of the city committee. Throughout the city, officers of state security and communists were hunted down and hanged from trees. Imre Nagy declared the dissolution of the Communist Party, the restoration of a multi-party system, and a break with the USSR. In response, Moscow decided to take harsh action. They established a new government in Hungary led by János Kádár, who promptly requested military assistance to quell the uprising. On November 4th, Operation Whirlwind began. Soviet tanks were once again deployed in Budapest. Defenders targeted them with Molotov cocktails and fired from the upper floors of buildings. Each building had to be stormed. Ultimately, the uprising was drowned in blood. Over 3 days, more than 2,500 Hungarians and 650 Soviet military personnel perished. Imre Nagy and hundreds of insurgents were executed. 850 people were transported to Soviet camps and prisons, while 13,000 were held in custody in their homeland. It was decided that Soviet troops would remain in Hungary as long as NATO existed, essentially indefinitely. Yuri Andropov, the future head of the KGB and the Soviet Union, played a significant role in suppressing the uprising as the Soviet ambassador to Hungary.
Watch this!
In 1968, the new leader of the Czechoslovak communists, Alexander Dubček, initiated a series of liberal and democratic reforms. Censorship was relaxed, the establishment of a multi-party system began, and there was an announcement of the rehabilitation of victims of political repression. This policy, known as the Prague Spring, garnered support from the general population but raised concerns in the Soviet Union. Moscow feared that it would lose control over Czechoslovakia. Throughout April and May 1968, Soviet leaders attempted to reason with Dubček. In response, he demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Czechoslovakia. Moscow couldn't agree to this. The Brezhnev-led Politburo decided to put an end to the reforms. The invasion began on the night of August 21, 1968. The Prague airport was seized and Soviet planes carrying paratroopers began landing there. Over 300,000 soldiers and officers and more than 7,000 tanks were introduced into the country. Dubček and his supporters were arrested and taken to Moscow. People took to the streets in Prague and other cities. They constructed barricades in the path of Soviet tanks and in some places threw Molotov cocktails at them. However, a massive bloodbath, like the one that occurred in Budapest 12 years earlier, was avoided. During the invasion, just over 100 citizens of Czechoslovakia were killed and 500 were wounded. People perished under the tank treads and from the bullets of Soviet soldiers. Under pressure, Dubček was compelled to accept Soviet terms in Moscow. Otherwise, Czechoslovakia faced a bloody crackdown on protesters and a harsh occupation regime. Soon, Gustav Husak, entirely loyal to the Kremlin, was placed at the helm of the country. Czechoslovakia remained a member of the Socialist Bloc. The Soviet occupational contingent remained in Czechoslovakia. It was only in 1991, following the Velvet Revolution's victory, that Soviet troops left the country.
Watch this!
The last Soviet occupation was the war in Afghanistan, which also became one of the reasons for the collapse of the USSR. The empire went through the same processes as in the early 20th century. Nations aspiring to independence achieved it, with the Baltic countries being among the first. The prison of nations closed its doors. The dissolution of the Soviet Union temporarily halted further expansion and aggression, but not for long. The ruling class did not reconcile, and Russia began to build up strength to reclaim what it considered its own. In some countries, this was achieved through political influence and economic blackmail. The examples are Belarus and the Central Asian countries, where resistance was encountered, force was once again employed. Russia's war with Georgia in 2008 resulted in territorial losses and the occupation of part of Georgian territory. Moscow established control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia. At the time, the Kremlin did not opt for a total annexation of the country. After some time, there was a change of power in Georgia, and a fairly loyal regime was established, which satisfied Russia. Western countries did not react, which fostered a sense of impunity among Russian leaders. Moscow began preparing for its ultimate battle, and the cherished dream of imperial ambitions was always Ukraine. Initially, they tried to bring it back into the sphere of Russian influence through economic and political pressure. Striking examples included gas blackmail and support for pro-Russian parties and politicians. This approach failed, and Ukraine made it clear that it saw its future with Europe, considering itself a member of the democratic world. Russia then decided to use force. The annexation of Crimea and parts of Donbass in 2014 served as a prelude to the bloody massacre initiated by the Kremlin's mad dictator. However, he and his accomplices underestimated the Ukrainian people's enduring desire to live without a yoke on their necks, their longing for complete independence, and their rejection of any dictatorship. Plans for the country's occupation within a few days fell apart, and Russia became embroiled in a long and bloody war. Unfortunately, a significant portion of Russian society, brainwashed by years of propaganda, accepts Putin's narratives and supports the war. yet very few can explain its true objectives.
Watch this!
The objectives of Russian aggression against Ukraine and other countries are simply and clear. Following the law that an empire must constantly expand, Russia seeks to seize and maintain as many countries and territories as it considers its own. Strangely, Russia considers all its adjacent territories as its own. Under any regime and ruler, as accurately termed by President Ronald Reagan, the evil empire strives to seize new territories and oppress the conquered nations. However, sooner or later, aggressors face repercussions. It is exactly what we are witnessing in the current situation with Ukraine. To be continued.